Early life on Mars may have wiped out early life on Mars, a new study suggests. This is by Even Go, Universe Today on Science Alert. Life might have wiped itself out on early Mars. That's not as absurd as it sounds. It's sort of what happened on Earth. But life on Earth evolved and persisted, while at Mars it did not persist. Evidence shows Mars was once warm and wet, and had an atmosphere. In the ancient Noachian period, between 3.7 billion and 4.1 billion years ago, Mars also had surface water. If this is correct, Mars may have been habitable, though that does not necessarily mean it was inhabited. That's based on evidence. Now, the new study shows that early Mars may have been hospitable to a type of organism that thrives in extreme environments here on Earth. Methanogens live in places like hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, where they convert chemical energy from their environment and release methane as a waste product. The study shows that methanogens may have thrived underground on Mars. The study is Early Mars Habitability and Global Cooling by H2-based Methanogens. It's published in Nature Astronomy, and the senior authors are Regis Ferrer and Boris Stottery. Ferrer is a professor in the University of Arizona Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and Stottery is a former postdoctoral fellow in Ferrer's group who is now at the Sorbonne in France. They said, our study shows that underground, early Mars would very likely have been habitable to methanogenic microbes, Ferrer said in a press release. However, the authors are clear that they are not saying that life definitely existed on the planet. The paper said that the microbes would have thrived in the porous, briny rock that sheltered them from UV radiation and cosmic rays. The underground environment would have been also provided a diffuse atmosphere and a moderated temperature that allowed methanogens to persist. The researchers focused on hydrogenotropic methanogens, which take in H2 and CO2 and produce methane as waste. This type of methanogenesis was one of the earliest metabolisms to evolve on Earth. However, its viability on early Mars has never quite been quantitatively evaluated, the paper said, until now. There's a critical difference between ancient Mars and Earth regarding this research. On Earth, most hydrogen is tied up in water molecules, and very little on it is on its own. But on Mars, it was abundant in the planet's atmosphere. The hydrogen could have been the energy supply early methanogens needed to thrive, and that same hydrogen would have helped trap heat in Mars' atmosphere, keeping the planet inhabitable. Ferrer said, we think Mars may have been a little cooler than Earth at the time, but not nearly as cold as it is now, with average temperatures hovering most likely above the freezing point of water. While current Mars has been described as an ice cube covered in dust, we imagine early Mars as a rocky planet with a porous crust, soaked in liquid water that likely formed lakes and rivers, perhaps even seas and oceans. On Earth, water is either salt water or fresh water, but on Mars, that distinction may not have been necessary. Instead, all of the water was briny, according to spectroscopic measurements of Martian surface rock. The research team used models of Mars climate, crust, and atmosphere to evaluate methanogens on ancient Mars. They also used a model of an ecological community of Earth-like microbes that metabolize hydrogen and carbon. By working with these ecosystem models, the researchers were able to predict whether methanogen populations were able to survive, but they went further. They were able to predict what effect these populations had on their environment. Once we had produced our model, we put it to work on the Martian crust, figuratively speaking, the paper's first author, Boris Stottery, said. This allowed us to evaluate how plausible a Martian underground biosphere would be, and if such a biosphere existed, how it would have modified the chemistry of the Martian crust, and how these processes in the crust would have affected the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Our goal was to make a model of the Martian crust with its mix of rocks and salty water, let gases from the atmosphere diffuse into the ground, and see whether methanogens could live with that, said Ferrer. And the answer is, generally speaking, yes. These microbes could have made a living on the planet's crust. The question became, how deep would you have to go to find it? It's a question of balance, according to the researchers. While the atmosphere held abundant hydrogen and carbon the organisms could have used for energy, Mars' surface was still cold, not frozen like it is today, but much colder than modern Earth. The microorganisms would have benefited from the warmer temperatures underground, but the deeper you go, the less hydrogen and carbon are available. The problem is that even on early Mars, it was still very cold on the surface, so microbes would have had to go deeper into the crust to find habitable temperatures, Soderity says. The question is, how deep does the biology need to go to find the right compromise between temperature and availability of molecules from the atmosphere they needed to grow? We found that the microbial communities in our models would have been happiest in the upper few hundreds of meters. They would not have remained nestled in the upper crust for a long time, but as the microbe communities persisted, taking in hydrogen and carbon and releasing methane, they would have changed the environment. The team modeled all of the above and below ground processes and how they would have influenced each other. They predicted the resulting climatic feedback and how it changed Mars' atmosphere. The team says that over time the methanogens would have initiated a global climatic cooling as they changed the atmosphere's chemical makeup. The briny water in the crust would have frozen to greater and greater depths as the planet cooled. That cooling would have eventually made Mars' surface uninhabitable. As the planet cooled, the organisms would have been driven further underground, away from the cold. But the porosity in the regolith would have become plugged by ice, blocking the atmosphere from reaching those depths and starving the methanogens of energy. According to our results, they said, Mars' atmosphere would have been completely changed by biological activity very rapidly, within a few tens or hundreds of thousands of years, Soderity said. By removing hydrogen from the atmosphere, microbes would have dramatically cooled down the planet's climate. The result? Extinction. The problem these microbes would have then faced is that Mars' atmosphere basically disappeared, completely thinned, so their energy source would have vanished. They would have had to find an alternate source of energy, Soderity said. In addition, the temperature would have dropped significantly, and they would have had to go much deeper into the crust. For the moment, it's very difficult to say how long Mars would have remained habitable. The researchers also identified places on the Martian surface where future missions have the best chances of finding evidence of the planet's ancient life. Near-surface populations would have been the most productive ones, therefore maximizing the likelihood of biomarkers preserved in detectable quantities, the authors write. The first few meters of the Martian crust are also the most easily accessible to exploration, given the technology currently embarked on Martian rovers. According to the researchers, Elash Planitia is the best place to look for evidence of this early underground life because it remained ice-free. Unfortunately, that region is home to powerful dust storms and unsuitable for rover exploration. According to the authors, if human explorers ever visit Mars, then Elash Planitia is an ideal exploration site. Life on Mars, ancient Mars, is no longer a revolutionary idea, and it has not been one for a long time. So the more interesting part of the research might be how early life changed its environment. That happened on Earth and led to the development of more complex life after the Great Oxygenation Event, GOE. Early Earth was inhabited by simple life forms as well, but Earth was different. Organisms involved a new pathway to harness energy. There was no oxygen in Earth's early atmosphere. The Earth's first inhabitants thrived in its absence. Then along came cyanobacteria, which used photosynthesis for energy and produced oxygen as a byproduct. Cyanobacteria liked oxygen, and Earth's first tenants did not. The cyanobacteria grew in mats that created a region of oxygenated water around themselves in which they thrived. Eventually, cyanobacteria oxygenated the oceans and atmosphere until Earth became toxic to other life. Methanogens and Earth's other early life cannot handle oxygen. Scientists don't quite call the death of all those primitive organisms an extinction, but the word comes close. Some ancient microbes or their descendants survived on modern-day Earth, driven into oxygen-poor environments. But that was Earth. On Mars, there was no evolutionary leap into photosynthesis or something else that led to a new way to acquire energy. Eventually, Mars cooled and froze and lost its atmosphere. Is Mars dead now? It's possible that Martian life found refuge in isolated locations in the planet's crust. In a 2021 study using modeling to show that there might be a source of hydrogen in Mars' crust, one that replenishes itself, the study showed that radioactive elements in the crust could break apart water molecules by radiolysis, making hydrogen available to methanogens. Radiolysis has allowed isolated communities of bacteria in water-filled cracks and pores in Earth's crust to persist for millions, possibly even billions of years. And the Deep Carbon Observatory found that life buried in Earth's crust contains up to 400 times the carbon mass of all humans. The DCO also found that the deep subsurface biosphere is almost twice the volume of the world's oceans. Could there still be life in Mars' crust feeding on hydrogen created by radiolysis? There are puzzling detections of methane in the atmosphere that are still unexplained. Many scientists think that the subsurface of Mars is the most likely place in the solar system to harbor life besides Earth. Of course, sorry Europa, maybe it does, and maybe we'll find it one day. This was originally published on Universe Today, and it's on Science Alert. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.